Well, good morning and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is part of a series focusing on the recently developed curriculum in sustainable resource management. This curriculum was commissioned as part of the Doing What Matters. The course curriculum features an instructor guidebook, resources, and 21 lessons with PowerPoints covering materials management, recycling, composting, reuse, and zero waste activities that focus on promoting upstream reduction of wasteful practices and materials consumption and disposal. Today's webinar is part 4 of a 4-part series designed to provide an overview of the curriculum for faculty and administrators interested in offering the course. Today's class specifically covers the 3 lessons on organics management, composting, and food and organics collection programs for residential, commercial, and industrial systems. Our presenter today is Matthew Cotton. Matt is the owner of Integrated Waste Management Consulting. He has over 25 years of experience in solid waste management, planning, permitting, policy, regulatory compliance, and composting. During this time, he has worked as a consultant, educator, researcher, and advocate for new and expanding organics recycling and composting programs in California and beyond. In over 25 years of work, Mr. Cotton has completed hundreds of significant solid waste projects, including permitting and assisting in the development of some of the major composting facilities in California. His company serves public, private, and institutional clients. He has served on the U.S. Composting Council Board of Directors since 1999, and he was elected president of the board in 2006, 7, and 8. He also serves on the board of directors of Californians Against Waste. So before I introduce Matt, I just wanted to remind everybody that we will take time for question and answers throughout the lesson today. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand as soon as you think of it, or go ahead and type it in your question box, which would be part of your panel. Just click the little plus on questions and you can type it in there. Or under the attendees, you can click to raise your hand. Do that when you think about it. That way when we come to a break, I'll know that somebody is waiting for a question and I'll be able to call on you immediately. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Matt to begin the presentation. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks, Judy. Good morning, everybody. This slide just talks about the overall overview of all the 3 lessons we've tried to put together today. A lot of stuff going on, really looking at the organic fraction of the waste stream and looking at different options for diverting organics, broad brush, and we'll talk about why organics is really different than the rest of the municipal waste stream. We'll talk a little bit about how composting works, and we'll look at a case study with the city of San Diego, and of course, finally, we'll talk about markets for compost. So here we are. So what do we mean by organics? You know, it's an often misunderstood word, but for the context of this course, we're talking about anything that was once alive or carbon-based is organic, things like plants and grass and leaves, which is not to be confused with certified organic, which is a specific type and practice of agriculture, which does relate to composting and how we use compost, but different in that sense. But somewhere between 35 to 40% of typical municipal waste streams are comprised of organic materials, things like leaves and grass and brush and paper. And there's a huge emphasis these days on food scraps, which are the #1 non-recycled item in most U.S. landfills, particularly on the West Coast, but elsewhere as well. So you've seen in other courses different pie charts of the U.S. waste characterization, and again, somewhere between 25 and 40% of that could be organic, showing yard trimmings there. And many jurisdictions divert yard trimmings. About half the states ban yard trimmings from landfill. But food waste can be 10 to 15%, and some paper is suitable for composting. We'd really rather most paper get recycled, but we've got that sort of grayed out because some programs are focusing on food soil paper, and you can use craft paper bags for collection, like in the photo there. So main point is there's a lot of organics in the waste stream and lots of different programs to divert them. So here's a good example to ask the class what types of paper might be composted instead of recycled and why. Things like pizza boxes, because they're sold with delicious pizza cheese, and maybe fast food packaging, that sort of thing. I'm sure they'll come up with all sorts of good examples of that. Looking at a California example, California's had really aggressive waste diversion in place for many years. So there's a lot more organics in the California waste stream because we've had 20 years of pulling out plastics, glass, paper and aluminum cans, et cetera. So a lot of organics left in the waste stream, maybe as much as 40 million tons of organics to be pulled out. And they're doing a great job with that, developing a lot of programs, a lot of policy and programs to divert organics from the waste stream into beneficial uses. This basically highlights how much more organics are in a place where they've had a long experience with traditional recycling. So then we get to larger scale policy, looking at EPA policy and trying to understand the waste management hierarchy and doing more source reduction and reuse, maybe a little, really focusing on recycling and composting with less focus on energy recovery and even less on treatment and disposal. In practice, we pretty much reverse this, but this is what we're shooting for as far as a policy guideline. Other reasons we recycle organics, most of this is driven by regulations and policy. Again, I mentioned about half the states have bans on yard trimmings going into landfills. Here in the West, we have a lot of very high recycling goals or even zero waste goals or very aggressive waste diversion goals. A lot of it started with trying to conserve landfill capacity. Landfills are really public resources and hard to site and expensive to develop, so we should be preserving those for things that don't have markets and really need to be landfilled. And organics is not one of those things. Of course, more and more greenhouse gases reducing methane. Organics in landfills generate methane, and only some of that is captured. We, of course, a lot of high moisture materials don't belong generally dry and like a dry tomb, so keeping out non-hazardous liquid wastes and things like food wastes are really good. And of course, we get a valuable resource. As the planet has more and more people on it, we need to recycle nutrients so that we can all eat delicious food and have access to food. So making compost is maybe the best reason, although from a policy standpoint, it's really more about regulations. So again, if you're going to have aggressive recycling goals, California has a 75% goal, Florida has a 75% goal, you really need to look at the organic waste stream. And again, increasing numbers of states ban some form of organics. A number of states now ban food scraps from landfills or have very aggressive policy to get food scraps out of landfills. Some cities have mandatory collection, big cities like Seattle and San Francisco and New York. Here's just a quick look of the states that ban yard trimmings from landfills, the blue states there. As you can see, predominantly on the east of the Mississippi, more or less, and some states are looking at challenging that, but quite a predominant number of states east of the Mississippi have banned yard trimmings, mostly because they have very seasonal leaf falls, and they were finding that was filling up landfills, and it seemed kind of silly to have a Subtitle D line landfill for just yard trimming. So a lot of composting going on in these places. You'll notice to the west, we don't really have bans typically, but places like Washington, Oregon, California have very high and aggressive waste diversion goals. Arizona just built a $10 million composting facility. Texas is doing quite a lot. We don't ban things in the West, and we tend to have more space for landfills, but we still see other good policy reasons for diverting organics and setting high recycling targets. So let's look a little bit more closely at why we recycle organics. Conserving landfill capacity. Obviously, a cubic yard of landfill space is going to be worth more in the future because more and more regulations happen, and it becomes more expensive to run a landfill, to operate a landfill. And so securing that space, reserving that space for things that really need to be landfill is a really good idea. Siting new landfills are extremely difficult, extremely costly. Nobody wants to live by a landfill. They drop property values. And of course, putting organics in landfills creates methane and leachate. I love this shot because you get to see that big amount of compost that's pulled out of that landfill, and you can just really see a direct relationship to that material, which has a great value in agriculture and horticulture and would have been otherwise landfilled and wasted. So kind of stark picture there. A lot of focus on reducing methane in landfills. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, and the number, whether it's 23 times or 80 times or 100 times as powerful as CO2 as a greenhouse gas, is hotly debated, and the landfill gas folks will tell you that they're collecting it, so let's just put the organics back in the landfill. But in reality, the collection systems are nowhere near 100% efficient. The EPA says they're 75% efficient, some systems more, some systems are less, but no matter what, it's much easier to reduce the organics going in and reduce the total amount of gas being generated than it is to measure how much you're actually calculating. Landfills are very large, and very imperfect vessels for anaerobic digestion. So reducing methane is one of the big drivers. And there's credits for that. You can actually get carbon credits now for diverting food waste from landfills in an effort to reduce the methane. Of course, we've all seen concentrated animal feeding operations, again, coming under more and more scrutiny as we understand how much manure is really generated, and that can lead to water pollution and odor problems. So trying to figure out a way to get more of this into a composting situation back onto land. Composting really stabilizes those nutrients and can reduce the water pollutant and nutrient loading from all the cattle feeding operations. And of course, some waste streams are just hard to recycle. This is a shot from the city of San Diego. This was an Earth Day event a few years ago, and you look at, they were collecting food waste, but of course you get a lot of food soil paper and a lot of the serviceware, cups and plates and forks, and fortunately that's all compostable. A little bit of food that was wasted, all that's going to get put together, mixed up, and composted. So some waste streams just aren't easily recycled except through a biological process like composting. And of course, we want to make compost. We take a hard-to-manage, unstable, generally stinky material and create this beautiful, manageable product with value. And we'll talk about a lot of the different uses and applications that compost has, but perhaps the most important is to return those nutrients back to the soil so we can grow crops and feed ourselves and have beautiful landscapes and have healthy soils. And composting is a very established way to manage organic materials. There's thousands of facilities around the country. There's thousands around North America. There's thousands around the world. There's just lots and lots. We know how to do composting. We know how it works. So we know what impacts there are. It's very well understood and demonstrated. The picture in the photo is a very simple, low-tech. That's called windrow composting. That's the most common way of making compost. Very low-tech. And simple, relatively low cost, very flexible to changes in feedstocks and changes in technology. You can throw your pizza boxes and food waste in that and still manage it the same way. So it's a very established technology, unlike some of the things that are out there being discussed, which sound very interesting but don't have a lot of experience. We know how to make compost. We know how it works. It's very reliable in that way. So what is this process? What does it mean? How do we define it? There's two ways to look at it. Composting, the process, is the aerobic biological decomposition of organic materials under controlled conditions. There's a lot to unpack there, and you should spend some time thinking about that. Aerobic means with air. Biological means the decomposition is done by biological organisms, and we're talking about the organic materials that we learned in the first slide, or things that were once living, things like plants, and under controlled conditions, which means we're managing it and we're facilitating this natural biological process. But we also use compost, the noun, as a product, which is the stabilized material resulting from the composting process. So there's the process where you manufacture the compost, and there's the compost itself. Good to keep those straight. So what are we talking about? What can we compost? Again, anything that's alive can be composted. Talking predominantly in the U.S. about yard trimmings, far and away the most common means of collecting yard trimmings. Although in that picture you can see the city of Austin there collecting yard trimmings using craft paper bags. So they're composting yard trimmings, but they're also composting that paper. So that's a type of paper that could be composted. Extremely common in most of the U.S. Easy to collect, easy to compost, really straightforward to compost yard trimmings. It's not challenging or technical. As we've said a few times now, about half the states ban some form of yard trimmings from landfill disposal. Most of that goes to composting. Not all of it, but the vast majority does go to composting. This is a little picture of an animal manure composting operation. This is a big cattle feeding operation in Central California, basically being composted on the same land as the feedlot, adding that manure and some bulking agent and stabilizing those nutrients and creating this great soil amendment which can be stored and stabilized and then used in the coming years as a soil amendment. Most of this compost actually goes to organic almond growers in this particular case. Very, very big among almond growers and tree crop growers. Lots of orchards use a lot of compost grapes. Lots of folks that use compost like this. Food scraps, again, I mentioned huge interest in diverting food scraps. Of course, we want to reduce food scraps and not create wasted food in the first place, but by the very nature of it, as you can see, potato peels and orange peels, you're always going to have some food waste if we insist on eating food. So a lot of effort. We've got our first federal policy in the U.S. to reduce the amount of food waste going into landfills by 50% by 2020. We've estimates are as much as 40% of the food from farm to table gets wasted, which is just absolutely crazy and wrong. And a number of states, including Vermont and Connecticut and now California, require commercial generators to figure out a way to collect this material and get it diverted somehow. And again, most of that is going to composting. Some of it's being digested, some of it's going to animal feed, but far and away, most of it's going to composting. Sewage sludge or biosolids, this is another organic material which we used to dump in the ocean. We stopped doing that way back in the 70s, and some of it goes to landfill, some of it gets directly land applied, but it's a great material for compost. You can see in the photo they're mixing that up with wood chips there and bulking that up to make a compost mix, and then they'll again use that in a variety of uses, golf courses and turf farms and such. Paper, here's some good examples of paper, the pizza boxes and fast food packaging. The larger photo is some U.S. government documents, paper shredded. The shredded paper is too fine to be recycled, again, but it makes a great compost feedstock, so you can just add that into a compost operation and get that returned back into a soil amendment. And to summarize, anything that was once alive can be composted. We're mostly talking about urban organic waste, things like leaves and brush and grass, food processing waste, lots of agricultural waste. This is actually a manure operation up in West Marin, nice bucolic setting there for a little composting and happy cows. And the more you develop these facilities, the more materials they tend to attract. As you develop a facility, people find out about it, and more organic materials are directed to composting facilities. So all sorts of weird organic things are being composted all over the country and indeed around the world. This slide is kind of important, and it takes a little time to unpack, but it's really critical to distinguish between traditional recycling, which some of the students may be familiar with, and composting, which really is fundamentally different. It's got a fancy animation here. With recycling, it's really largely about collecting cans and bottles and paper, and then you bring them to a MRF or a transfer station and put them in a machine which pretty much makes them into a square, into a cube, like a bale of paper or a bale of aluminum, and then that gets shipped off and typically through a broker, and may go through a number of steps. But the people involved in collecting it and processing it usually are not the same people that are manufacturing it or selling canned sheet to Anheuser-Busch to make new cans for beer. So it's much more about collecting and processing and then shipping it off-site, whereas composting, you still have to collect it and you still have to process it, but you're actually typically the same people collecting it and processing it are also manufacturing it, as well as doing the post-processing and making a product. Most of the compost that's made in the U.S. is manufactured locally and marketed locally, so you're not relying on distant markets, you're not relying on international markets or the price of steel that day to market your compost. You've got to develop local markets and figure out how that can be managed locally. So that's really fundamentally different than most recycling. I think it's important to make that distinction. Let's see. So how does it work? Well, composting is a biological process. It's run by microorganisms, which are already there. It tends to work on organic feedstocks. It is an extension of natural decay, although we're managing it and controlling it and hopefully accelerating it a little bit. It's aerobic, or at least predominantly so, which means it's done in the presence of oxygen. You need air to compost. And the bugs that are eating these delicious organic feedstocks are breathing and generating heat, which creates a thermophilic circumstance so that the process is hot, which helps sterilize weed seeds and brings in other bugs. And at the end of the day, you make compost from that. So it's a multi-stage biological process. Here's sort of what it looks like. We've got our feedstocks, which is just a word for organic material like our leaves, our brush, our grass. all which have minerals and microbes and water. We're not adding any of those things. They're all in there already. And then we typically add water. Air is getting into the pile naturally. The microorganisms are getting there naturally. And we put them in the pile and mix that together. And in the end, we've got finished compost, which is really stable organic matter, the same minerals, the same microbes. It's really just the biological stabilization process that's happening. And during the process, we're giving off water vapor. It's generating heat. We're giving off some CO2. And there can be odors from the process as well. And this is obviously a very simplified graphic, but describes a very complex manufacturing process in one slide. So, another important thing to understand that this is a biological process, and so the biological principles are the same regardless of the scale or technology. So small, little on-farm composting operation taking some food waste from a local music festival, mixing that in with some straw and composting that, are worried about the same conditions, the same biological conditions, and trying to provide the right conditions to let the microbes thrive as much larger facilities. This is a nice Central Coast regional green waste composting facility, taking in predominantly leaves and grass and brush, composting that, and again worried about the same biological parameters as the on-farm guy, as well as the world's most expensive compost facility, which is inside of a building and uses all sorts of fancy technology. It's still worrying about the same fundamental biological principles. So it's all the same no matter how you make it. The process is exactly the same. And how that works, the microorganisms which are there eat the organic matter. You note they're eating on the surface and taking bites just like we do. And they get nutrients and energy from that organic matter, and they create the compost, and they become part of the compost. So it's all the actions really happening at the microbial level. The key factors that you worry about are moisture, and that's perhaps, if there was a most important factor, I think all 6 of these are equally important, but moisture is very important. The bugs have to live in the surface film, so you've got to have adequate moisture for them to be able to move around and get access to the food. Oxygen is maybe the next most important, and oxygen happens through aeration, either through particle size or through forcing that with fans or blowers. The pile mechanics, the density of the pile, the density of the material, the porosity, the particle size, the structure, and the shape of the wood chips or the apple cores that you're composting are all very important. What types of things you're composting, or the feedstocks? Is this a yard waste composting facility, or are you composting food scraps? The balance of that mix is really important. And of course temperature, and temperature happens automatically. The heat of the bugs consuming all this organic material raises the temperature and creates heat that then leads to a succession of bacteria and weed seed kill and pathogen reduction, and ultimately the process takes time, and it can take a wide variety of time depending on how you're doing it, what your ingredients are, what technology you're using. But those 6 factors are really the key factors, and really none is more important than the other. You have to balance all 6 of these to make the process work the right way. So we'll go through each of these. This is just a quick little graph to take a look at. You want it moist. Some people say moist is a wrung out sponge, but you want to start with about 50% moisture. It's hard to get it too wet, but if it is too wet, or if you get a lot of rain where you are, it can start to make the pile very heavy and make it hard for the pile to breathe, and you might have runoff. But around 50% is about right, and if it gets too dry, then it really slows down considerably. But it's a fairly big range that you can operate within. Oxygen, of course, is required for aerobic respiration, and the bugs eating can really exhaust the oxygen very quickly, so you have to make sure you have enough porosity or structure to make sure oxygen can flow into your pile. Much like a room gets hot after lunch, you're all eating and respiring and digesting that food, so high oxygen levels are pretty good. Some literature suggests something around 10%, even 16%. That can be hard to achieve in a windrow system, but it seems to, turns out more and more that porosity is really important to provide that aeration. Of course, ambient air is about 21% oxygen, and oxygen is delivered via aeration, so either the pile is naturally drawing air into it, or you're forcing that in with a pump or a fan or something like that, but really important. And you can do that either passively or actively again. Passively through the pile shape and size and structure, or actively through a fan or a blower. I think we have some pictures of those coming up later. We talk about pile mechanics, looking at this handful of wood chips, structure and density and shape. You can imagine air flowing through that really bulky pile pretty easily, and maybe less so with a pile of food waste. So you've got to blend things together to make sure everything's working. This is kind of a complicated little drawing, but the idea, the little brown particles are the organic matter. You've got the little blue layer of liquid film around them where the microorganisms are living. You've got air flowing through the pile, and on the left-hand side, if you look on the right-hand side, if they're too tight, too much moisture, you don't have enough pore space and free air space, it can be very challenging for the process to work. So we've got to keep it light and fluffy. So if you remember nothing else from this, just remember your compost pile has to be light and fluffy, not dense and thick. So feedstocks, again, feedstocks are just a fancy word for what we compost. Things like leaves and grass and brush or food waste. They all have chemical characteristics and physical characteristics. They may have other characteristics like contamination or cost or availability that limit or determine what you can and can't compost. So you can characterize all these things by its chemical properties, by its physical properties, or other properties as well as you're thinking about what you want to compost or what you have to compost and how you're going to make that happen. We haven't really talked about carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's a little hard to grasp quickly. Fundamentally, it's just a ratio of the total mass of carbon to the total mass of nitrogen, and it's just an overall gauge of balance in a composting process. It's always expressed with carbon to nitrogen, so it's always 30 carbon to 1 nitrogen or 50 carbon to 1 nitrogen. Doesn't really talk about degradability or surface area, but it's a very real academic fact, and it's a very common thing that people talk about when they talk about composting. What's your carbon to nitrogen ratio? And the way you achieve a balanced carbon-nitrogen ratio is to mix materials together. Things with a lot of carbon are things like brush and leaves, and things with less carbon are things like grass and food waste, things that are wet and dense versus things that are dry and bulky. So with this fabulous high-tech graphic, we sort of show the idea of how you would blend those things together to make a nice balanced mix with a balanced carbon-nitrogen ratio and a balanced moisture content and balanced porosity, so you can get airflow in there and keep your bugs happy. So this chart tries to show some phases of a typical aerobic composting process with the temperature on the right-hand side and the compost facility progressing in time. You can see in the beginning it's not that much above ambient temperature, and as it starts to warm up in the first phase, it's going to get up into the thermophilic phase fairly quickly, maybe in just a couple of days, hopefully, and then stay at a relatively elevated temperatures. 140 degrees is hot to your hand. You're going to burn your hand if you touch material that's 140 degrees. And you can see the process has been turned. Maybe you added water, so the temperature dips down a little bit and comes back up, and dips down and comes back up. But we're really talking about a relatively high temperature process for a fair amount of time. And really don't call it compost until we see that temperature start to drop and the process starts to cure and mature and stabilize. And that can take 1 month, that can take 9 months. That can, people compost at a really, really broad range of time. There's people that try to compost really fast, and there are people that have a lot of time and space and maybe take a year or more to compost. And they're all making compost, and each process is legitimate and fine. It just depends on what you're composting and how you're composting and what you're trying to do, and maybe involves your seasons and things like winter and things. But and every composting process follows more or less this same time, starting off with mesophilic bacteria and succeeding into thermophilic or heat-loving bacteria. Somewhere, again, easily getting up to 140 degrees, but hoping to pass 131 degrees, which is the federal EPA pathogen threshold. So you're usually spending quite a bit of time well above 131 degrees Fahrenheit. And this happens naturally. Again, there's lots of natural heat that happens with all this biological activity going on. So it's not challenging to do this. It's a natural byproduct of the process. So in summary, for thermophilic composting, again, 50 to 60% moisture. You can be a little bit broader than that. These are just, rule of thumb sort of guidelines. Carbon nitrogen ratio, maybe 35 to 40 to 1. The book says 25 to 35 to 1, but much higher is certainly possible and extremely common. Bulk density, maybe 1,000 pounds per cubic yard, which again is somewhat fluffy. Start to get a little heavier than that, then it really is hard for aeration to get in, oxygen to get into the pile. And as we just discussed, temperatures easily getting above 120 degrees within the first week and well above 140 for a couple of weeks, and probably really want to stay below 160 and rarely past 170, only because as you get to these very high temperatures, eventually you can in fact catch the pile on fire, which is really not preferred. We'd really prefer you didn't catch the piles on fire, and that's not that easy to do with small piles, but larger piles can easily get to 180 degrees, in which case you have to make the piles smaller, basically, and avoid spontaneous combustion. Oxygen, again, it's going to relate to porosity, but 5% is probably fine, 10% is better. Most manufacturers don't even spend a lot of time measuring oxygen, hoping that they get there with porosity. And the same with carbon dioxide. You can measure one or the other and give you some indication of how well your pile is breathing. As far as particle size, probably don't need to worry about it. Greater than 2 inches is probably fine. And bigger particles are fine because that gives you more porosity and more free airspace. Keep it light and fluffy. So that's sort of how composting works. Judy, do we want to take a break and see if we have questions at that point? I went through that kind of fast.
Yeah, I don't see any questions, but I had one that I was hoping you could just spend a minute explaining the importance of the 131 degree pathogen threshold.
Sure, and that's just a federal threshold that comes from composting sewage sludge back in the 70s. They did the research and found that that was an important number to reach for a given amount of time in order to kill pathogens. And they're mostly focusing on biosolids in that case, and mostly worried about people playing in the compost and putting it in their mouth. And so it's a very robust threshold. It's not hard to meet. It's easy for most facilities to meet and get that pathogen reduction. And it's something that distinguishes compost from stuff which is not compost, like raw manure or raw sewage sludge or other things we directly apply to land. But it's fairly common, fairly easy to do in most composting projects.
Great, thanks. Well, we don't have any other questions, but if you do have questions, go ahead and put them in your question box, and as we get to the next break after the next lesson, I'll make sure to let Matt know.
Thanks, Judy. Okay, so now we know how composting works, and let's see how that applies to a program. Again, why do we collect organics? Food, as we mentioned, is the #1 non-recycled item in landfills. Maybe 30% of everything that's disposed is compostable or digestible. Food in landfills is not a good thing. It generates methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. And nutrients in food are really best returned to the soil. And hopefully this new recent focus on food scrap management and food scrap reduction will lead to better food utilization. But in the end, we still generate a lot of food waste, and that should be separated out of the municipal waste stream and brought to some beneficial use, of which composting is probably the most common. This is a different way to look at the same hierarchy that we showed in the last lesson, trying to reduce the amount of food waste we generate and be smarter about how we buy and consume food. And if we have extra food, then certainly getting that to people who need it through food banks and other things and donation programs. Failing that, if it's not suitable for that, we'd like to feed animals and not feed, so feed people, feed livestock, and don't feed the landfills. If it doesn't work for that, we can compost it, we can make renewable energy from it by digestion, and the absolute last resort should be disposal. Food really doesn't belong in landfills and causes all sorts of problems there. So this is why you see a big national effort to reduce food waste and lots of programs and ideas and thoughts and tools to try to figure out how to keep food out of landfills. Because there's a lot of it out there, and it's just a shame. We really need to figure out a way to use that more efficiently, especially if we're going to continue growing the world's population making food. This is another way to look at it. You know, huge amount, 40% perhaps of all the food that we buy and process and manufacture is never eaten. So that's really a moral outrage, and it's great that we're spending a lot of effort to try to do something about it. And the fail-safe for that is composting. But trying to reduce food in the first place is really what we should be doing, and we are doing that. So maybe you do that in your own daily life. Maybe you can think of some steps you can take to make changes to reduce food waste. Anybody out there have any ideas on doing that? Judy, do you have any ideas on reducing food waste in your life?
Yes, I actually, one of the things I started doing was shopping more frequently, because I did notice, especially with my boys, that when we would shop once a week, a lot of stuff went to waste. So that's one of the steps I've taken.
Excellent. I'm sure there's others out there as well. And the cost of food scraps, when you really look at all the fuel that's used and the water that's used and how much money is spent, it's really a tremendous amount of waste. It's an inefficiency that's just horrible, and we're spending a lot of resources to figure it out because we're just landfilling way too much of it. And if we're growing it, then we should absolutely honor the people that grew it and spent the time and the money and the effort to make that, and really try to consume that or feed it to animals. So where's the food? Where's all this food waste we're talking about? Well, events are a great place to start. It's usually easy for many jurisdictions to think about an event they might have. The pictures from the Amgen Tour of California, which was set out both recycling bins and food waste bins and got the food waste to composting. There's all sorts of resources out there for green event planning, and this is a nice gateway for communities to start figuring out how to reduce less food. Looking at big sources in your community, grocery stores, really big place for food waste for a lot of different reasons. Again, a lot of grocery stores, big ones, are already collecting that and composting or getting it to anaerobic digestion, sometimes backhauling it to a central location. But just the nature of food stores, you're going to have some amount of food waste. Unfortunately, a lot of that is already being collected and sent to composting. Different ways to do this, of course, you know, depending on what the store wants to do and how the store works. There's a lot of different ways to collect it and get it to composting. Larger stores might even have a dedicated compactor like this one at a Whole Foods market. Whole Foods found out they could dramatically increase their recycling by adding food scraps. I mean, going from 25 or 25% recycling to over 85% or 90% recycling just by adding food waste. That gives you some idea of just how much food they have. Restaurants have a ton of food. Food trucks, you know, anywhere food is processed, manufactured, consumed, big office parks, schools, of course, and the kids love it. You can see, look at these happy children who are collecting food scraps. Lots of different ways to make this an educational opportunity and also divert that food scraps. Big institutions like large office complexes or universities or prisons, big sports stadiums are all composting now and should be and will be in the future. Trade shows, office campuses, again, anywhere that wants to and is putting a large amount of people together is going to have a lot of food and a lot of food waste, especially if you're dealing with a transient population like a trade show or something. So how do you do this? Well, you know, don't collect it. Reduce it first off. You could manage it on site, or you could collect it and take it to a composting site. Sending to a food bank is a great idea. All sorts of resources out there. There's software that will help you understand how much food you're wasting and try to get you to do different things. The U.S. EPA has a food recovery challenge to try to challenge people to get food, to reduce the amount of food they're wasting, and then to get that into a food bank or an animal feed situation. Of course, you can compost it on site. Lots of ways to do this, either traditional way or with worms or with dehydrators, other things. There are some off-the-shelf on-site composting tools that are out there. This facility was a kind of a hospice facility which put in a small composter and were able to pay for that within 2 years just by the avoided cost of disposal. So a very successful project. There's lots of advantages to it, and there are some disadvantages which you can go over. But fundamentally, you know, what are you going to collect? Where are you going to take it? And maybe the where you're going to take it is the most important question. What does the end user require? Are they going to accept food soil paper? Are they going to accept compostable plastics? How much can they handle? And where else can you take it? And Do you need specialized containers? And all these are out there and manufactured, lots of different ways to collect food from the counter to the curb and from the bakery into the thing. So, wow, that went quick. But that was some idea of how a program works. Any other questions out there?
We don't have questions, but I thought this would be a good opportunity for me just to briefly explain the tie-in with the Capstone project. So instructors that are going to be offering this course, the organics is a very important part of the Capstone project that the students could be working on. And so just really reinforced with the students, whether they're working in the community capstone project or the business capstone project, that organics is a big part of what we're looking at now, especially in California. And so things that students could do related to the organics would be obviously in the community project, if they're working on it, looking at what organics collection programs are currently in place, maybe what types of programs are coming up, and even looking to identify what are some of the major organics producers within the community, and if they are already sort of plugged into what's going on. On the business side, they could look at the business that they're working with to identify what sort of organics are being collected. You know, is there food on site, cafeteria, food service, or maybe it might be more landscaping, agricultural, you know, wood products. So identifying where the organics are being generated from within the business and what the local opportunities are to connect them to programs, maybe working with other businesses locally to create a market or a demand for that. So it is important that if they are doing a capstone project, whether for the business or the community side, that they bring that organics piece into it and tie that into the AB 1826 legislation within the state. So I just wanted to piece that part in there with it. And then Matt's going to talk a little bit more about some of the processing. But yeah, that's pretty much all I had at that point.
Excellent. Thanks, Julie. Let's talk about some of these commercial organics programs, and we'll give a little case study and talk about compost markets here. This is a great graphic because it shows the whole sort of countertop to the pail, sort of out to the curb, and from the curb to the truck, and the truck to a processing facility, whether it's a compost facility or an anaerobic digestion facility. And either way, you get the solids which go back on the field, and we grow more plants, and we get them to the store, and the whole cycle goes around. So I kind of like that closed loop image that this provides, and shows one example of the types of containers you might use in a residential food scrap collection. But all sorts of industry groups generate a lot of food. We talked about grocery stores, but restaurants, whether they're fast food restaurants or sit-down restaurants, large hotels, big shopping malls, big public venues like sports stadiums or universities or colleges. So there's all sorts of places to find food, and significant amounts of food out there in the waste stream to be diverted to composting. This is just a quick photo tour of how Whole Foods works. They're separating the food at the grocery store, putting in that dedicated compactor that they have, getting that out to a composting site, and then actually taking the compost, selling the compost, but also growing plants and compost and growing the fruit and getting it back to the store. So closing the loop and really going towards a zero waste. So real quickly, we'll just do a little case study of the city of San Diego. They've had a fairly robust commercial food scraps program for many, many years. It's a fairly large city, about 1.3 million, and at the moment generating about 50,000 tons of commercial food scraps per year. It's convenient because they own and operate their own composting facilities, so they had a lot of generators they could target, but they always had, fundamentally, they had a place to take it, and that's perhaps the hardest part of developing a program, whether it's a one store or one school program or an entire jurisdictional program. You've got to have a place to take it. The city had their own composting facility, which made that easy. So, so they go after all sorts of generators. This is a big generator, the UC San Diego, which is a very large campus with many, many restaurants and food opportunities to it. And you can see the truck there being unloaded at the compost facility. All of that entire container, that entire compactor is all full of food waste, which is going to get composted. So just a little bit about the facility. It's about a 400 ton per day facility, simple outdoor turned windrow. It's at the city's landfill. It's publicly owned, publicly operated. Again, they've been doing it since 1985. And they added food scraps in 2005. So almost 10 years, maybe a little more than 10 years, they've been doing the food scraps composting, and surrounded by an active military base. And even the military base, the food from the military base comes to the compost facility, Petco Park, a lot of the big grocery stores and restaurants, and it's expanding all the time. But again, the key is having that facility and then figuring out how to collect that material. This is a really complex drawing. I apologize for that. Just showing how they made space for the windrows on top of the landfill and were able to really divert a tremendous amount of material and manufacture compost on top of their landfill and make that work. This is sort of how it works. Materials come in at the scale house. They get charged and diverted up to the composting site, and then the organics, as you can see, mostly yard waste in this case, being unloaded and processed. The food waste comes in, and you can see they surround that with yard trimmings. They're going to mix that up and make the appropriate mix for a proper composting situation. But nothing high tech. Again, just like the yard waste, they just throw the food waste in there, mix it up, and compost it. Both commercial and industrial, institutional sources. If things need to be ground, like the yard waste, they grind it up with this big grinder, and then they make really pretty low-tech turned windrow piles like we've seen earlier, using a specialized turner on top of the landfill. And then once it's composted, they put it through this screen and suck out all the plastic and make this beautiful compost, which mostly goes to agriculture and nurseries around there, put it in trucks and load it out, and goes up to avocado orchards and different things that are grown there in the city of San Diego. And they sell the compost to residents. You can come and get it. They have different grades of compost, and they're also selling chips and colored wood chips and things. So it's been a very successful program for the city of San Diego. Really quickly, I just want to talk about compost markets. I always get questions about where did all the compost go, and here on the West Coast, and particularly in California, we're extremely lucky. We have the world's largest agricultural production. So in California, most of the compost goes to agriculture and all sorts of different crops, particularly cash crops, particularly orchards, but all sorts of crops use compost. There's dozens and dozens of crop types that we're the #1 producer of. So there's really no problem selling compost into agriculture, and millions of tons go into agriculture every year. We also have great horticultural markets, landscapers and garden centers, and high-end retail and golf courses. So we have really enviable markets here in California. Not every other state is like that, but we're very fortunate that we have robust markets for all these products and different places to take the compost. Of course, you can use compost in parks and highways and land reclamation. We've spent years working with Caltrans to get them to use compost, and mine reclamation, and lots of different retailers. Again, we've really been very fortunate that we have a lot of markets in California and a lot of end uses for compost, and a lot of time spent teaching people about compost and getting specifications written. So it's really not hard to move compost. In fact, the bigger problem in California is we don't have enough compost. We need to make a lot more of it and get it out to these various uses. I think that gets us to the end. So do we have any other questions at this point?
We don't have any questions. If anybody has questions, now would be a great time. We have a little bit of extra time here at the end of the webinar. So I know that composting can be a very technical topic, part of the training. So most of the curriculum is based around more practical day-to-day type of systems, recycling, but this one's definitely more technical, so it's a great opportunity for you to be able to get your questions about the process to Matt. So let's see, we have one question that says, what is your preference between composting and anaerobic digestion?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I don't have a preference. As I mentioned, composting is very well established. We have lots of facilities, so in most cases, your nearest composting facility is going to be a lot closer than your nearest anaerobic digestion facility. We've got a few of those in California now, but really not that many. So I don't really have a preference. I would go to whichever one makes the most sense. I think anaerobic digestion is neat in that you can get some of the energy off of that, but that cleverness sort of comes at a high cost as well. So, you know, we've got a handful of anaerobic digestion facilities in the state. We'll see if we build a lot more of those. But in the meantime, we have hundreds of compost facilities. So whichever one's closer, whichever one's cheaper makes the most sense for me. But either one is just fine. So.
Great. I wanted to bring up as well, and I'm pulling up the lessons, and sorry, I know you guys heard my dog going a little bit crazy in the background, so I apologize for that.
Composting.
Yeah, not the mailman though, so I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that there were a number of resources in the instructor guide to help out as well, especially if you want to make sure you become a little bit more familiar with the process prior to it. So there's links to the U.S. Composting Council website. There's links to BioCycle, which basically focuses on organics management. There's links to CalRecycle website, as well as the National Sustainable Agricultural Education Service website. There's also a reading document, which is the executive summary of the state of composting that you can review. And then there's also a good resource that I had found. I haven't gotten Matt's input on how he feels about this webinar series, but there is a webinar series called the Organic Stream, and they have, I believe it's 10 or 12 very short online lessons that you can learn about composting process and various applications of it. That I watched a few lessons and I was impressed with it. It was put together really well. So that can give you some additional background information on, you know, various processes and things they're doing around the world with regard to organics. So we did try and include quite a few, you know, resources for you as an instructor to be able to, you know, kind of get up to speed on it. All right, so I don't see any other questions. Matt, did you have any other closing comments or things that you wanted to add?
No, I'm good. I'm always here to help if instructors have questions, or they can email me or get them through you to me, and then we'll happily try to clarify this delightful composting thing.
Great. Actually, we had a few more questions come in. Let's go ahead and read these. So it says, the Zero Waste International Alliance is developing a policy paper suggesting that composting is preferable and that anaerobic digestion should only be used if the digest state is composted afterwards. What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I'm from a policy standpoint, absolutely. I think you absolutely have to be composting that digest state. It doesn't make any sense. The relatively small amount of gas that you get off versus the cost of digestion is a great bonus, but the whole point is to divert the organics, and the value is in the nutrients of that solid digestate and the liquid digestate as well. But yeah, absolutely, I'm certainly in favor of that solid digestate being composted, so absolutely.
Oh, right. I completely agree. In fact, I have another question, but let's see. We have another one from the audience. It says the EPA has also has a great series of, oh, this is a comment more. Okay. So a great series of webinars through their SMM Web Academy. Great. So we actually need to add that. I'll take a look at that. And are you familiar with that, Matt?
No, I'm not, and I haven't actually sat through the Organic Stream ones either, but I'm sure they're excellent. Those guys do great work. Their podcasts are lovely, so I'm sure these are all good resources for people that want to get into this space and teach these type of courses. So a lot of info out there.
So, and I don't want to get into a big discussion on this, but what are your, you know, there's a lot of smaller systems out there now for businesses that claim to be composting, you know, heating up the organics. And did you want to touch a little bit on what some of the differences are between those machines and
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I think you're going to see a return to the marketing of some of these things, and some of them are in fact legitimate composters. Some of them are dehydrators. Some of them are just macerators that grind them up and put it into the sewage system. I think people looking at those just have to be very skeptical about what the claims are and what the real inputs are, whether they be energy or water, or whether or not the sewage system really wants all their ground up food to be put down the drain. There's really there's a great paper that was done by Joe Rasmussen, who's now at CalRecycle, who was at professor at Loyola Marymount. He tested a bunch of those and looked at the products, and so I recommend that study to people that might be looking at those. I expect there to be a great marketing push as California moves towards more implementation of 1826, and you've got to be as smart as you can about what these machines really do and take those claims very skeptically. Typically, you're not going to be able to take raw organic material and stabilize it in less than 30 days. So if someone makes a claim that they can do that in 3 days or less, then they're probably trying to sell you something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like a lot of them just want to put a lot of energy in and heat it and, basically turn it into nothing, which I know a lot of, businesses think that that's composting, and you have to try and explain that that's not really composting, it's a different process, but I think there's a lot of confusion related to the dehydrators and some of the on-site systems that are out there. So
Agreed.
what was the study again? Because I can make sure to get a link. It was a.
I'll just send it. I can send you a link. I don't remember the name of it, but I've got it here, so I can shoot it to you. It's a really nicely done sort of academic look at what these machines actually do and what the inputs are and what you might want to think about if you're considering those.
Great. All right, so I'll make sure to get that link out to the attendees as well. All right, well, I think that is definitely bringing us to the end of our webinar, and thank you so much. I know it's a lot of information to sort of digest in such a short period of time, but thank you, Matt, for being making it as simple as possible to explain the slides and the information contained. So this will actually conclude our 4-part series on the Sustainable Resource Management curriculum. And if you do have any questions, you can go ahead and reach out to me, or you can reach out to West Valley College, who's overseeing basically the distribution of the curriculum, and we're going to be trying to bring in a few updates and a few other resources for those instructors that are looking to offer this to help you out through that process. So we thank you for attending, and good luck for all of you out there that are going to be rolling out this program, and that will conclude our webinar. So thanks very much, Matt.
Thanks, Judy.